and houseboats on nearly dry land. This is the scene in part of Manaus, a riverside community of northern Brazil, except that some areas of the river are little more than puddles. A drought, it's taking its toll on the Amazon, the second longest river on Earth. The port of Manaus has recorded water levels lower than it's seen in more than a century. As the Amazon's tributaries dry out, some communities like this one aren't only parched, they're cut off as their food, water, and medical supplies are delivered by boat. The Brazilian government says it is sending help to places that have been isolated, and it blames El Niño, a natural warming of Pacific Ocean temperatures, for causing this year's drought. Brazil expects things will stay dry until December at least. Makes sense, we've got stories from all across the globe today on The World from A to Z, and it's great to have you traveling with us. My name is Carl Azus, and our next stop is in the Middle East. U.S. President Joe Biden is scheduled to visit Israel Wednesday. Officials say there are several reasons for his trip to the region. One, express the U.S. government's support for Israel in its war against Hamas, the group that controls the Palestinian territory of Gaza. 2, encourage the Israeli government to do all it can to protect Palestinian civilians in Gaza. 3, encourage humanitarian assistance for the people who need it. Many people in this part of the world support the Palestinians. Israeli officials say the militant Hamas leaders of Gaza killed 1,300 people, most of them civilians, in a terrorist attack on Israel on October 7th. Palestinian authorities say Israel's counterattacks in Gaza have killed 3,000 people, many of them civilians. Israel has cut off electricity, food, and gas supplies to the territory. Israeli officials say members of Hamas typically hide within the civilian population. The challenge of protecting those who are innocent is immense as Israel prepares for a ground invasion of Gaza to rid the territory of Hamas. There was an explosion at a hospital there earlier this week, and authorities fear that hundreds of lives were lost. Palestinian officials blamed Israeli airstrikes for the blast. Israeli officials blamed a failed rocket attack from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another militant or terrorist group that's fighting Israel.
A world of knowledge. Which of these countries is the only one that borders the Baltic Sea? Norway, Poland, Slovakia, Austria. Norway borders the North and Norwegian seas, and Slovakia and Austria are landlocked, leaving Poland as the answer.
New challenges may be ahead for Poland's government. Exit polls indicate there was a record turnout for the nation's parliamentary elections this week, and while Poland's ruling Law and Justice Party got more votes than any other, it's not likely it maintained enough seats to pass laws. It could be that 3 opposition parties will join together in a coalition, but with limited power. Economic, social, and environmental legislation, how Poland interacts with Ukraine and the European Union, all that could be affected. It may mark another chapter for a country with a long history of political changes.
At an excavation site in one of Warsaw's main public spaces, archaeologists are unearthing long hidden history. It's part of a planned reconstruction of a distinctive 17th century Saxon palace that stood on what is now Pilsudski Square. Built for a nobleman, it was once home to composer Frédéric Chopin, and then served as a meeting site for Polish military staff after the First World War. The Nazis blew up most of the ornate historic buildings here on the square during their occupation in World War II. But the buildings were razed only to the ground, no further. One remnant became a tomb for the unknown soldier. Life above ground went on, leaving history below, until now. Archaeologists recently excavated cellars containing everything from 18th century ceramics and utensils to a secret military tunnel from the 1930s that doesn't appear on any of the building's plans. It appears to have connected Polish army leaders to military intelligence so they could communicate more quickly. The archaeology phase is the first in what may be a challenging project. Plans call for the palace rebuild, set to open in 2030, to house government buildings, cultural centers, restaurants, and cafes. But not everyone agrees it's a good idea. With a price tag of around $600 million US, some critics say the money would be better spent elsewhere. Others, they hope it will unify the country, a reminder of cultural heritage. One thing that can be agreed upon: after being destroyed by war, part of Poland's history is now being rediscovered layer by layer. For The World from A to Z, I'm Lindsay Wolfgang Mast.
On this date in world history, James Dewey, Francis Harry Compton, and Maurice Hugh Frederick may ring no bells, but they won the Nobel Prize for Medicine on October 18, 1962, and you probably will recognize their last names of Watson, Crick, and Wilkins, who discovered the double helix structure of DNA. Going back a few more years, this was the date in 1898 that the U.S. flag was raised over Puerto Rico in the Spanish-American War. That showed that the U.S. had won control of the colony, which had formerly been governed by Spain. Alaska Day is celebrated on October 18th because it was on this date in 1867 that the territory was officially transferred from Russia to the United States. And finally, an American author's book was first published in England in 1851. The author was Herman Melville. The book was called Moby Dick, or The Whale, and its publication stateside came less than a month later. Also on this date in World A to Z history, we are officially on YouTube. We've heard from so many of you teachers talking about the convenience, the accessibility, the translations, and we are now live. The address, youtube.com/@theworldfroma to Z. You have to include that @ symbol. youtube.com/@theworldfroma to Z, and we'll see you on YouTube. Along the Nile's 4,100-mile path through Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, pollution is threatening scores of people whose living conditions depend on the world's longest river. It's not just one source, and it's not just one type of contamination. As the continent's population has grown, so has the presence of wastewater, pesticides, land sediment, medical waste, possibly even discarded electronics, all making their way into the Nile. In the Central African country of Uganda, officials say systems to clean the water simply aren't in place.
Africa's longest river is under threat. Jawali has been fishing on the Nile for decades, but industrial waste dumped into the water is having a devastating effect on the river's ecosystem.
These factories are pouring out the chemicals that they use in animal hide processing, and it's killing a lot of young fish. The factories always release the chemicals when it's raining, and a lot of fish die.
Those living along the river are paying the price, like in Uganda, in towns like Jinja, where many are concerned for their livelihoods as fish stocks continue to deplete year by year. Some have already quit the trade.
I imagine that the time will come when people will stop coming here to fish. It will be a waste of time. They would spend like 3 days with nothing to catch and go home empty-handed. The reason why we were given boreholes is because of the river water. There was a time when the water changed and people couldn't use it for cooking or for bathing because even after a shower your skin would itch, and even fish started dying because of the toxins.
And it isn't just chemicals polluting the water. Other kinds of waste and rubbish are also finding their way into the river. A report published by the Nile Basin Initiative has warned that untreated water, pesticides and fertilisers dumped into the river are an unprecedented threat to the area's biodiversity. And with little infrastructure in place to properly clean the water, the issue will likely worsen for both humans and the environment all along the mighty Nile.
Mr. Evans and Miss Ott are getting some recognition today. In Hartford, South Dakota, the Trojans are on the march at West Central Middle School. Thank you, Mr. Evans, for using our show. Of course, the same goes for you, Miss Ott, and your students in Poughkeepsie, New York. We've got Orville A. Todd Middle watching the world from A to Z. Politics can be really rough to get into. Some might say it's a dog-eat-dog field. That's not deterring this canine candidate, though. Miko's campaign manager, that would be his owner, Robert Ziggy Ziegler, wants the people of Anchorage, Alaska to write in Miko for mayor next year. He says the choice is clear if a little hairy and thinks differing sides will come together to pet Miko anyway. He's even hung banners up around town. Ziegler admits that Miko is easily influenced, usually with treats. When asked about the potential for corruption during the last lifted leg of a dog whistle stop tour, Miko was malamute on the subject, thought the question too political, a offense to his dogma. But when it comes to licensing, land leashes, and especially treaties, a canine it needs the agility to field rough questions even from the doghouse. I'm Carl Azus for The World from A to Z. Come on back tomorrow. You mean the world to us.